Greetings, my name is Dave Householder, and I'm coming to you from the World Wide Well. I feel just this compulsion almost to publish something every day, to post something every day, a teaching from the Bible, the ultimate book of encouragement for discouraging times. And that could go for today's chapter 2, Revelation chapter 2, if you'd like to look at that. This was the beginning of the hard times of the Christian church. The church was becoming powerful, and therefore those folks in power didn't like that and came against the church. And starting in the second half of the first century AD, Jesus was crucified and the resurrection happened around 33 AD. The second half of that century, the persecution started to kick in and people started to suffer for their faith. And this went on for centuries until the early 300s when the Christian faith became legal in the Roman Empire. And to become a Christian was somewhat subversive. We have no church buildings from that era because they couldn't meet in public. They had to meet in homes and catacombs and fields, wherever they could meet safely. And John is writing here, this book, the book of Revelation, is written to 7 churches. So I'm sure 7 copies were sent out, or maybe it was a letter that was cyclical that was brought around to the 7 churches. But in chapter 2, he talks to 4 of them. And he starts out in chapter 1, verse 4, John to the 7 churches that are in Asia. He doesn't say John telling you how the world's going to end. And that disappoints some people when they go to a study on the book of Revelation. They just want to find out what the secret code is. But I'm going to walk you through eschatology. And eschatology has to do with how the story ends. That's a fancy theological term for end times, and you can Google eschatology and look up lots of different views on the end times. And views on the end times are wide open because the end times haven't happened yet. So there's a lot of legitimate biblical views on the end time that are divergent from one another, that have different points of view based on what people find in the Bible. But let's look at Revelation chapter 2. He writes to 4 churches here. The churches in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Thyatira. And then in chapter 3, which we won't be covering today, he writes the church in Sardis, in Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So, the 4 churches he writes to. Now, this is really important. John is not writing to these churches to tell them how the world is going to end. He writes to these churches to tell them how to survive and how to thrive and how to become victorious in persecution, because the persecution is starting to ramp up. Their 2020, which lasted centuries, is starting. And he tells them, hey, this is how you get through things. So the book of Revelation is outstanding to encourage people to get through rough stuff. And the basic thrust of the story is the power of the Lord is stronger than the powers of persecution, and hang on to the end and you'll be blessed by that. So hold fast and stick it out, and hold on to your faith and don't compromise during this time. And that's a very good message for 2020 for that matter. So he writes to Ephesus, and he says here in verse 4, but I have this against you, that you've abandoned the love you had at first. So he's not telling them, hey, this is how the world's going to end. He says, your faith has somewhat cooled, and that happens to a lot of us, where our faith starts to cool. And if our faith is cooling during a time of persecution or a rough year like 2020, it's going to do us less and less good. We have to rekindle our faith on a regular basis and get into the Word a lot and worship together. We're worshiping together at the Well. If you're in Southern California, please join us this Sunday. It's the 20th of September, 2020, and we're going to be gathering again for the first time in a long time. And please bring your masks, social distancing, all that kind of stuff. We want everyone to feel safe. Even if you feel like you don't need to wear a mask, it helps others sometimes to feel safe. So please show up and respect one another and enjoy being together, because it's the being together that really lights up our faith. If you take coals in a barbecue, charcoals, and you separate them out, they all cool off. You bring them together, they heat each other up. And we want that glow of being together physically. And he says here in verse 7 to the church in Ephesus, to the one who conquers I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. To the one who sticks it out, the one who wins this battle, the one who faces the persecution, it's going to be worth it. Then he writes to the church in Smyrna, and he says in verse 10, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison. You're going to suffer for your faith. You're going to go to jail for your faith. But don't fear. And he says there, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Do you see this recurring theme here? The church in Pergamum, he says here in verse 17, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. And that's beautiful encouragement, poetic encouragement. And says, stick it out, be strong, stand firm, hold fast. And in verse 20, he says to the church in Thyatira, but I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols, both of which were a big deal in the early church, two of the biggest issues they dealt with, and it comes up all over the New Testament. It says, hold fast to your faith and your practice and your morality and your ethics, even when it's hard. And writes to them in code language here. Jezebel, that's goes back to the Old Testament, some kind of nasty stuff in there, and often uses code language here to protect himself and to protect the church in case they find this letter, in case the enemies find this letter, because if they find the letter, then if certain names are in there, then people could get in trouble. So there's a lot of code names in here. So there's plausible deniability in spy movie language. So a lot of these images you have in the book of Revelation have to do with people living at the time. Verse 25 to the church in Thyatira, only hold fast to what you have until I come. The one who conquers and who keeps my words until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations. So this is a book of encouragement, and we have to look at the whole book in the sense that he's writing to churches in the present time, and the purpose of the book is not to, in secret language, tell how the world's going to end thousands of years later. The purpose of the book is to encourage people to get through persecution, and a lot of imagery is used for that. And I'm very, very blessed by a book by N.T. Wright called History and Eschatology. Eschatology, of course, the study of the last things. And on page 134, he writes that apocalyptic literature, and this is called the Apocalypse of John. Apocalypse means the opening or revelation in Latin, apocalypse in Greek, you uncover things. And the word apocalyptic, I suggest, is best used to denote a genre, or at least a literary form in use, where the writers intend to denote, pay attention to the word denote, what we call this world realities, like they're dealing with in these 7 churches, this world realities, and to connote, pay attention to that name, that word, theological meaning. Thus, for instance, the monster or beast in Daniel 7 or Revelation 13 would denote a pagan emperor at the time. And so they're talking about somebody in code language, plausible deniability, that's existing at the time. And connote, for all times, the dark anti-God forces that come up out of the sea, the place of chaos and evil. So apocalyptic, that's a fun word to say, apocalyptic literature is denoting what is going on in the lives of the people who receive the letter and how to stick it out during these hard times. And code language is used to denote certain political figures and people living at the time. And then it connotes for all time, for us, the kind of realities that happen during persecution and the kind of blessings and rewards that go to those who are faithful during difficult times. Is there anything more admirable than a person who makes it during a difficult time and sticks it out to the very end? That's what we all aspire to be one of those people. We all hope that under persecution we would be that way. So in the year 2020, how do we remain faithful? How do we rekindle our first love? How do we watch our ethics and our morality? How do we pay attention to the things we need to pay attention to during these times? How do we look forward to the reward the Lord gives us for being faithful, even in a difficult year like 2020? I had one Bible teacher come and talk to our seminary once, and he said, the important thing about the Bible is to know what it meant and what it means. That's denote and connote. To understand what it meant to these 7 churches, that it meant have courage, and have courage because the Lord has overcome the world. You're going to get through this together. And what it means for us is that those truths that are in this book are true for all time. And the kind of things that happen then can happen now. And that we need to pay attention to the patterns and themes here. And this book then can encourage us during difficult times, just like it encouraged the folks in the churches in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Thyatira. That's the good news for today. That's our eschatology and history lesson for today. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope that you can remain faithful, that you rekindle your first love with the Lord, and that you look at persecution and difficult times with faith. And use difficult times to lean into your faith, not to lean out of it. That's what we all aspire to from the book of Revelation, and that's our first little introduction to eschatology. I'll be saying a lot more about that in the future, so stay tuned, and I'll talk to you again real soon.